Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. It's been a long time since our last episode, but we have been seeing each other quite frequently in the last autumn, webinar series. So welcome back to the ELTea Time chat show, and glad to see you again. So let me know in the chat box where you're based and where you're watching this ELTea Time from in the chat box. Feel free to let me know how's the weather like in your place as well. Yeah, before that, I will just introduce myself very quickly. I am Super from Macmillan Education. I'm going to be the host for today's ELTea Time chat show. And we have two great speakers for today's topic. We're going to talk about extensive reading today. So, are you able to chat in the chat box? I'm not seeing any chat going on in the chat box. Let me know if it is possible to chat. And you can also use the Q&A. Use the Q&A button there. Oh, there you go. Hi, I'm Emerald from Vietnam. Sorry about my pronunciation if it's not right. Hi from Thailand. Hello. So we still have a very diverse group here from all places from Asia today, I guess. Okay, great. You can use the chat box. That's a great news. Hello, welcome back. Yeah, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce two of our guest speakers today. So welcome to the stage, Del and Rob.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, Super.
Hi.
How are you?
Hello.
Hi, Rob.
Great. How are you?
Everyone.
Doing good. Yeah, it's a bit of a murky day here in Bangkok. I'm in just outside of Bangkok in Nonthaburi, and it's been a bit rainy and wet and miserable. So I'm hoping the rain stays off. I want to go on my bike later. Where are you, Rob?
I'm in Japan. I'm in Okayama at the moment, but I travel a lot, particularly all over Southeast Asia. I'm in next month. I'm going off to Korea, then Thailand, and then Australia, and then back to Thailand, Cambodia, Indonesia. So I travel a lot to talk about extensive reading. So not to China yet for a while. I haven't been there for 3 years, so hopefully we can get there soon.
Yeah.
We really look forward to that kind of events as well. So Rob,
yes.
You mentioned that you travel a lot to talk about extensive reading. So could you please introduce yourself a little bit to our audience as well?
Okay, so my name's Rob Waring. I'm a emeritus professor at a university in Western Japan, where I have been for the last 30 years. I quit my university in March so that I could be more freelance and do more promotion of extensive reading, extensive listening, and particularly common sense in vocabulary teaching. I've done a lot of talks for the Extensive Reading Foundation, which we'll talk about later, and for various universities, and even Macmillan. Macmillan have given me talks in Vietnam and in Bangkok and various other places. So I also write graded readers, books for students to read in English, and I'm an academic. I do a lot of publications and so on and so on. So I'm quite busy.
Yes. It's a privilege to have Rob with us today to talk about his expertise on reading, especially extensive reading. So now I think we are all ready to go, right, Del? How about you?
Yeah, I'm ready to go. I'm really looking forward to talking to Rob today.
Pleasure.
We've met obviously online. We've never met in person, but I've been aware of you and what you've been doing for a long time now. So it's really nice to. I'm hopefully going to learn lots today as well. So let's get going.
Yes. So teachers, feel free to ask questions or have some discussions together in the chat box. Yeah, while we go. So let's just to start with our first question. So maybe starting from Rob, as an expert in like this field, could you please let us know what is your definition? How do you define like extensive reading in your context?
Okay, so extensive reading is a particular way of reading. It's a type of reading that involves students reading a lot of easy material at their level so they can build fluency and that they can build reading confidence and so on. So this is very similar to the way that you read in your first language. When you read in your first language, you just read and you enjoy, you're focused on comprehension, you're focused on meaning. But often in English language teaching, a lot of the reading that we do is quite difficult, and it would be in course books. So, something like this, there'll be a short passage, something like this, which students would read, and some follow-up questions here, and maybe some further follow-up questions on other pages. So this type of reading is usually quite difficult, and we call that intensive reading. And it's perfectly fine. But the focus of intensive reading is about focusing on the language. It's a language focus activity to learn new vocabulary, learn new grammar, and so on. So extensive reading is the fluency, the practicing of that.
Yes. Thank you very much for a very detailed explanation, and also with the comparison with intensive reading. And going back to Del, would you like to add anything to that point of view?
I always kind of thought of extensive reading as being reading for pleasure. That's what I always thought it sort of related to. So it's particularly in teaching, it's something that students hopefully would be doing sort of in their own time, outside of the classroom, to have the enjoyment of reading, rather than what Rob says, where they're reading in the class for focusing on the language, on the vocabulary, the grammar, as a tool to help them then understand that. Whereas extensive reading it's driven by the actual content rather than the language. Whereas
Correct.
The reading in textbooks is driven mainly by the language and kind of related to a topic. Would you say, Rob, that in your L1 that you wouldn't do that much intensive reading as compared to extensive reading?
Okay, so I think what we're focusing on here is we have to think about what our brain is doing, whether we're reading extensively or whether we're not. If your brain is focused on the language and is focused on the details of something, then probably you're more language focused or idea focused, in terms of, if I'm reading an academic article, for example, it's very dense with lots of complicated phrases. I'll have to read it slowly and carefully. Is it enjoyable? Not always. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. So, but if I'm reading, let's say, a novel, and currently I'm rereading Harry Potter, I'm up to book 7 again. And so that kind of thing, where I would read for enjoyment, to get involved in the story, and I'm not worried so much about the language. But I just want to pick up on one thing you'd said before about extensive reading being enjoyable. Yes, that's certainly the goal. We want to try and find books that are enjoyable. So these, for example, are some Macmillan readers that I have here. Some famous stories. This is Good Wives. This is Washington Square, and so on. So these 2 books here are classic stories that were written that have been simplified for students. And sometimes we have original books like this one, The Umbrella. Now, in a perfect world, everybody would be reading for pleasure. The problem is that it's very difficult to get students to find that book which is really, really going to switch them on to be a reader. So as teachers, I think we hope to provide interesting, motivating material. But what we have to be careful with the pleasure idea is, a student can say, look, I've looked at 100 books. None of these books interest me. I'm not going to read. So we have to be careful. So a goal is pleasure, but a much more important goal is making sure that students actually practice their reading with as much enjoyment as possible. So as teachers, we need to understand our library. We need to understand which books we have, be able to guide the student. So if a student says, I ask the student, what are you reading? and I noticed that she's reading a romance, I'd say, oh, look, this is a really good romance story. Why don't you read this one next? Or, wow, you like horror stuff. Well, here's a really good horror story. So I think pleasure is a goal, but it's not as important as actually getting the students to do the practice. We don't want to give them an option to say, I don't want to do this. So we need to make sure we do that. So luckily, particularly with the Macmillan readers, which are some of the best readers out there, there's lots of very interesting materials for them. However, you know, there will always be students who are just not interested in literature. Thank you very much. So what we need to do is to make sure that they get, say, non-fiction material, which might be something connected with history or science or biology. We need those types of readings as well. And there's good language reasons why we need that. So another point that you mentioned, Del, was that a lot of this reading would be done out of class. And I think that's certainly, again, an aim. However, initially, we have to make sure that the reading is done in class. When they're starting extensive reading, it's done in class so that, first of all, the students know what they have to do and what level they need to read. They have to read at the right level so that they can understand something without a dictionary. And many students who've only ever done, you know, textbook reading, they assume that the only type of valid reading is reading that is done for language focus, where I have to learn new stuff. And they believe that when I read, I have to read something with lots of difficult language so I can learn stuff. We need to switch them off that. And that will take some training in class to get them used to just reading fluently for meaning. And we need to train them to know how to monitor their reading, and we need to check that they are sharing stories. And also, so if I read this story and you read that story in class, we would discuss our stories. I read this was the story, did you like it? Yes, I did. No, I didn't, right? So when you say it's out of class, a lot of the reading is out of class eventually, but we need to bring it back into the classroom so that the reading that we do outside of class is then brought back into class so that we can share the reading, share the best books, share the ideas of what's going on. But more importantly, we need to make sure there's skill transfer. So when they're reading something, that will become speaking, therefore listening, or reading might become writing if you write a report about your book, and so on. So there's a very strong connection with the classroom. As well. So extensive reading, I think, probably would be more an integrated part of the program where the actual reading is done out of class. However, it's important to have some of the time in class so the teacher can monitor that they're doing it and checking they're not reading at a difficult level, a time for them to change books and so on. So in my class, when I join my class at 9 o'clock in the morning, all students are told, you must be reading quietly when Professor Waring walks into the classroom. Silence when Waring's walking into the classroom. So that I give them like 10 minutes to read as I'm getting the, you know, the presentation ready, as I'm getting my text ready, getting the photocopies ready. It's a dead time in the class, but I want them to read the beginning of class. So I think there's a very strong connection between the two. Does that seem to make sense to you, Del?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think what else maybe that you haven't mentioned, which I think is equally as important, or is as important, is that the students are seeing the value that's put on it by dedicating class time to it. Yes. So they're recognizing that this is something that the professor, the teacher values, and therefore maybe I should value this as well and give it a chance before saying I don't want to read any literature. Yeah. And
I to follow up on that and to say it in a somewhat different way, I think a big message that we often get wrong with extensive reading is to say it should be for pleasure, it should be optional, you should be motivated to read. We want you to learn that love of reading by yourself. But if we don't force students to read initially, many of them are going to do exactly what students always do, which is opt out. If we make it optional, they will opt out. Why? Because they're busy, other things involved, they've got boyfriends, they've got tests, they've got a life, they've got sports. So it's very important, I think, that we require this reading. And I just want to spend a minute or two explaining why it's essential that they do this. I think what we need to understand is that a lot of the textbook reading that we do is, if you look at a textbook, each text has, let's say, 12 units, and each one of those units is a different topic. So it might be, for example, travel. It might be unit 2 would be about something different. Unit 3 about something different. Each of them have their own vocabulary and their own grammar focus. The problem is that the topics that are in, say, unit 2 probably will not come again in unit 3 or unit 7 or unit 12, because the focus is always on new.
Yeah.
The problem with that is there's an underlying theory that students only need to meet language 1 or 2 times in order to master it, which of course is not true, because we know that students forget. We know students forget. And, you know, you can't remember the names of the students in your class last year. What did you have for breakfast last week? You just can't remember. So if we have this new model, and the problem is that that knowledge is going to be lost over time. What extensive reading does is it works with the textbook. So the first grammar items and vocabulary items in the textbook will be met again in the reading. So the two must work together. And the idea of the reading is to deepen and strengthen the knowledge which they met in their course book. So when they go to the next unit, they then meet the next grammar and vocabulary through extensive reading. And the idea is there's a progression that the extensive reading will build on previous knowledge that the textbook's got. A major problem we have is that wherever I go in the world, people often ask me, like, why is it that after 5, 8, 10, 15 years, my students still cannot speak, read, and write? Well, the reason is they've only been doing new. And they haven't been building the depth of knowledge. And that's why it's essential extensive reading is done. It's not an option here, because if we only continue with new, we know students forget, and probably we're building in demotivation. We're building in a negative attitude towards English, because students, they honestly try and they take their tests and they love their classes, they love their teacher, they love their textbook, but at the end of the semester, they've forgotten it all because it's been focused on new, right? So it's essential that these things go together. The textbook will provide the introduction, and the extensive reading provides the depth of knowledge where you can see words and grammar working together.
Yeah.
It's not an option, not an option, unless we want unmotivated, disinterested, disengaged students, which is 90% of what we deal with. And I think the problem is that the vast majority of schools don't have this depth that they build on top of their existing course books. Nothing wrong with course books. Course books are great, but they can only do half of what we need.
Yeah, so I think like most of the teachers and students are quite used to the intensive reading we do with the course books, and they always wonder like how they could effectively integrate or introduce the extensive reading, into the classroom.
These things are very carefully written. You know, they're very carefully written so that, you know, look at the very early level. So this is a starter level book, for example. This one here would be written with, for example, only present simple tenses, very, very simple language, no past tenses in this book. Why? Because the student is very, very early in their career of learning. They haven't met past tenses in their course book yet. So they need to make sure that the textbook has, that the textbook is supported by reading material that practices the grammar and vocabulary again and again and again that they've just been working on in their textbook. When they've read, say, 20, 30 books at this level, then they move up to the next level. And this level would have, say, past tenses and maybe present perfect tense. But it would not have, say, past perfect or some more complicated stuff. And that's what we do when we get to the third level. The third level will have the more complicated grammar, the more complicated vocabulary, right? So these things are especially written in a systematic way. And that's the key. Systematically written to build on what's happening in the course books. It's not random. Not like Harry Potter. Harry Potter's random because the vocabulary and grammar, we don't know what's coming. It's not been edited to make sure you're practicing that. And it's really important to have that, particularly when students only meet English 1, 2, or 3 hours a week. If you remember our forgetting curve, we teach something today, 3, 4 days from now, it's gone. So while we're waiting for next week's class to appear, that's when we do our reading out of class so that we don't forget. So the extensive reading is about maintaining what you've learned in the classroom. If you don't do the extensive reading, poof, it's probably going to be lost.
I think it's also interesting. there was a quote. I remember doing a session on reading earlier on in this year about reading in the digital classroom, and I came across Christine Nuttall, who wrote teaching reading skills, and she has a very nice quote, which is, the best way to improve your knowledge of a foreign language is to go and live among its speakers. Well, most of our students don't have that option. They're learning English in the classroom, and then outside of it, they very rarely come into contact with it. And then she says that the next best way is to read extensively in it. And I think that sort of sums up exactly what you've said about not only just the recycling of the language, but being kind of immersed in a language, in a story, and then in a context within that story, because your mind's got all these things going on and you're imagining where you are in the story. So it's incredibly powerful. And yeah, I mean, it's so many benefits.
Yeah, there are. I mean, it's just the consolidation, and this is what we forget about. You know, we consolidate and we consolidate. We have to make the knowledge stronger so that we can use it. And I think there's yet another reason that's very important, is that it sounds strange because, you know, speaking is a productive activity. Writing is a productive activity. And many people learn English in order to speak, right? They're not particularly interested in writing. They want to be able to speak to people, right? So the problem is that speaking is the hardest skill because you have to formulate the sentences in your head. And if you don't know how to put the grammar and the vocabulary that you've got together, you're going to end up sounding very strange. So if I asked my student, you know, what did you do on the weekend? They would probably say something like, me go Tokyo, new dress, red, very good. Boyfriend's happy, right? Now, I understand what you mean, but they don't have control over knowing which verb to use. Do I say went to Kobe, have been to Kobe, had been to Kobe, traveled to Kobe? Do they say to Kobe, to Osaka, to Tokyo, to Tokyo, at Tokyo, in Tokyo? They just don't have enough experience with those words and grammar together so that they can start to speak. Extensive reading builds that experience with the language. They will see how words and grammar go together because they're meeting thousands and thousands and thousands of words a week. They will build up a sense, this is really important, a sense of how things sound and how things feel, right? So if I ask most students and say, do we say beautiful girl or do we say handsome girl? They will say beautiful girl. I ask why, and I don't know. Does your dictionary tell you? No. But what you've done is you've developed a feeling for beautiful plus female and handsome plus male. Nobody probably taught you that. Or why do we say strong cheese, weak, strong cheese? Do we say weak cheese? No, we say mild cheese. Why? Well, well, the thing is, we picked up that sense of what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And we can only do that from experience. And extensive reading gives you that sense of language that when you've got enough knowledge, when your knowledge goes to a certain level, then you're able to use that knowledge. Because most students will not speak and will not say what they want to until they have that feeling of comfort that I'm ready to use this now because I'm worried what the handsome boy next to me is going to be saying, right? Will he laugh at me? Will I sound strange? Will I get the red pen from the teacher? Will somebody go like, huh? What are you talking about? Right? So they're afraid of being able to speak. Extensive reading gives that confidence in understanding what feels right and what doesn't feel right. And the key here is that I, as a teacher, cannot teach that to you. You have to build that yourself as a student. It's a self-contained, self-built system. And as teachers, our primary responsibility is to give students enough input for them to be able to build that sense of language themselves. And only when you have enough sense of, I feel comfortable with this, will you start to speak and write. The problem is this experience is missing for most people. They can only get to hear and don't feel confident about speaking, and therefore they have mangled text, like I said before.
Cool. Very interesting. Thank you.
Yes, exactly. We have to build up that language by doing a lot of extensive reading. And teachers have some questions in the chat box.
Yes, I just noticed one here about activities. I want to mention one thing. I'm part of the Extensive Reading Foundation. And one of the goals that we have is to make sure that teachers and students know what extensive reading is. And we've produced a book. That's this book here, A Guide to Extensive Reading. And this is available on the website. And I'm just going to share the website with you for a second. This is the ER Foundation website. And I'll type the link in the chat for you. So inside the ER Foundation website, there are many different things. This is about the Extensive Reading Foundation itself and all the affiliate organizations. So we have extensive reading associations in many countries, Korea, we have them in Japan, we have them in the Middle East, in Taiwan, Indonesia, China, Thailand, Vietnam, and so on. So if you are interested in extensive reading, you want to join one of these groups, please click through here, right? This tab here tells us about extensive reading, and this is where the guides are. The guides are here. So if you look in here, right?
I think Sweep has put that in the chat, haven't you, Sweep, already?
Right. So these guides, we have them in multiple languages, English, Japanese, Korean. So please download. Now, the reason I mentioned that was because in the back of one of these books, in the back of the guide, there is two and a half pages about activities, extensive reading activities. There's a whole lot of activities here. And on the next page, we have more and more and more and more. So please look here if you want to find out about some activities. Yeah.
Okay. I think that question that was from Amir, wasn't it? Yeah. So Amir, nice to see you, Amir. Have a look at those guides and get some help from there.
Yes, thank you very much for sharing. And also in terms of how can we get started by integrating extensive reading into the classroom, I think you can find some ideas in the guide as well, right, Rob?
Yes, that's right. Yeah. If you're interested in starting an extensive reading program, the guide will help you. But another thing that might help you as well is this YouTube video. I'm not sure if all of you can access YouTube video, but it's Extensive Reading 101, the basics for understanding extensive reading, what it is, why we do it, and so on and so on. And so that's one guide for you, which is about 45 minutes or so. But the ER Foundation has its own YouTube channel. And in here, there are literally hundreds and hundreds of talks about extensive reading that you can use to learn about activities and so on and so on. So please take a chance to have a look at that as well.
Yes, fantastic. I have shared the link in the chat box with the teachers as well.
That's great. Thank you so much. Yeah. And come along to a talk about extensive reading.
Yeah, and you do use a lot of graded readers, and you also write graded readers for extensive reading programs, right?
Yes, I do. And so the graded readers are, for those people who don't know, they're written, as I said before, at different difficulty levels. So this one here would be for starter level students, yeah? And there's only I think only 100 different words in that book, yeah? The next book up is the beginner level books. And then, as you can see, we have other books at different levels, yes? Right.
I have a question about
the idea is the students would level up through these books. And Macmillan has several hundred books that you can use to build the fluency for your students. Yeah, there's quite a lot of books, yeah?
So I've got a question about the actual writing of those graded readers. You mentioned that you've written your own graded readers, Rob. Have you? So are these original stories, or are they abridged versions?
So some of them are original stories, starting at the very low level. So one series that I did was called Foundations Reading Library, which is it starts at 75 different words, but the books themselves are like 500, 800 words long. 75 words, then 100 different words, and so on. Yeah, all the way up.
How do you do that? How do you go about choosing the words, and then how do you put that into a story?
Can you see these bags under my eyes? It's an awful lot of practice. So when you're writing at the to complete that story, I've written some original stories myself. I've also worked on some non-fiction material, like some history material, and I've worked on another series of 100 books on general national sort of geography topics as well. And also I've worked on as an editor on original fiction series. So the problem that you've got is when we were doing our original fiction series, which unfortunately wasn't with Macmillan, we asked authors to come to write for us. And everybody seems to want to write at the intermediate level and above. Why? Because they want to tell their story. They're interested in telling their story. And it's very, very hard to find authors who can write a good, engaging story with 6 verbs. Right?
Yeah.
That's really hard, right? So if you've only got 6 verbs, it's very difficult to write a motivating story. So you have to start with a really clear idea of what you want to write about. And so when you're writing a graded reader, there are 3 things to think about. 3 things, okay? The first thing is story. The second thing is story. And you can guess the third one, right?
Yeah.
If you don't have a good story, the students are going to put it down. So the key then is making sure that when you're writing the story, you have a very good idea of what types of language are taught in typical, let's say, beginner level course books. So what is a typical course book structure for grammar? So we start with the be verb, maybe be negatives, then we get to present simple, we then present simple negatives and questions, we move on to present continuous. There's a kind of accepted what we call a pedagogical syllabus, and we have to try and write within that. And so it means editing and editing and editing and editing. And if I have only 75 words, I can't bring new words in unless I put them in a glossary. Now, many of the books would have a glossary at the back where you've got special words, like a small dictionary in the back of the books.
Yes,
These Macmillan books don't have that, but some of them do. So words which are specific for that story, let's say about football or kite or something, they would go in a glossary and they would be taught before the students start to read.
Okay, I get it. Yeah.
So it's very, very difficult. You need to have a very, very good sense of how to write very easy text using very, very simple words that still makes it sound natural. And some people are worried. They think that graded readers, well, if you're not using the full English, it's not actually proper English. But there's been some studies by a lady called Gillian Claridge and various other people that have looked at the actual grammar, the vocabulary use in there, the phrasing and so on, and have found that actually it's very, very similar to native text, except just using easier vocabulary. So it's not unnatural. Books written 30, 40 years ago probably were not as good. They'd be saying things like, you know, Jack went up the hill, Jane went up the hill, they had a good time, they came down. Very boring type of text. But recently, nobody writes that type of material anymore. So a lot of it's very engaging stuff. And some of the stories, honestly, I've had students cry in class. There's a book called, a book called Love Story, which we all read together. And if you don't know the movie Love Story, please go and watch it. I have about 40% of my students cry at the end of that story. And that really shows that these things can be impactful. Yeah. Excellent.
Well, I think that's a nice place to kind of finish the discussion, really. I mean,
we do have a question about does Macmillan have any books for very young readers? Maybe you guys can answer that for us.
I think so. I think it's been posted. There's been a link been posted to
excellent.
Have a look at that. We have talk about texts there, and then the reader's catalog as well. Lovely. But yeah, I mean, any lesson where you have someone crying because of an emotion, rather obviously not a negative emotion, but an emotion would be a memorable lesson, and that's what we want.
Well, as I said to you before, when I start my class every week with the students, I ask the students to read, and so after 10 minutes, you know, the students are just reading their books, and they're reading their books, right? And I'd sort of say, okay, girls, because it's at Women's University, okay, girls, put your books down. We're now going to do something, and they're like, okay, girls, please. Okay, and they're kind of like, you can them still reading, you know? And I feel so sad about that, because I'm thinking, well, these girls are learning, they're enjoying, they're engaged in English, and I'm stopping it. It's like, I feel bad about it, but we can't only do extensive reading, right?
Absolutely.
It's part of a balanced curriculum. Extensive reading should be a part of the balanced curriculum, yeah? So I think that if those of you who are not doing extensive reading now have learned something about extensive reading today, one of my hopes today is that you would feel guilty that maybe I should be doing extensive reading when I'm not actually doing extensive reading now. So if any of you are interested in extensive reading, please explore these websites. Please download the extensive reading guide. Next year in Bali, we're going to have a World Congress on extensive reading in August 7 to 11, where people come from all over the world to talk for 4 days, only about extensive reading, extensive listening. It's in Bali, and we hope Macmillan are going to be there as well, and you can meet some of the people in person. And that is part of the Extensive Reading Foundation as well. And I will try to find you the link. If you want to come along to Bali, if you always wanted to go to Bali for a personal trip, or you also wanted to come to a conference to meet me or some of the other people from Macmillan, please come along. You can just come as a visitor as well. You don't have to present. So please come along.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing, Rob. And we
My pleasure.
have been so lucky to have you and listening to your talk, and also being able to access so many resources about extensive reading. And
You're
thank you
welcome.
again for your time. So
yeah, I would echo, sorry, Suba, just before you sign off, I would echo what Guy has written in the chat as well. We're so lucky to have access to Rob, who is undoubtedly the leading authority on intensive and extensive reading. And I completely agree. It's been a real pleasure for me. And normally I do quite a bit of talking, and it's nice to have someone else.
Oh, I'm difficult to shut up. I can keep going and keep going and keep going. Maybe this should be 3 hours. Yeah. If anybody's interested, if anybody's interested in wanting to listen to people talk about extensive reading, the Extensive Reading Special Interest Group is in Japan here. I think it's every 4th Friday, they have like an open Zoom chat where you can just come along and you can just talk to people who know something about extensive reading. So please find the Extensive Reading Special Interest Group for the Japan Association of Language Teachers. I'll see if I can find a link, and it's called Loungers. So you can just sit and talk, and you bring a cup of tea.
Wonderful.
Wonderful.
Over to you, Super.
Yes. So thank you very much for the audience, and thank you for your ideas contributed in the chat box.
Thank you, everyone.
We will see you very soon in the next episode of ELTea Time. And thank you, Rob. Thank you, Dao.
Take care. See you in Thailand.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, see you soon in Thailand.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Take care. Bye.